Do the collab characters in epicseven actually need a buff? That's what we're going to talk about today. But before we get into that, as you could probably tell, this is on my alt channel that I'm going to be making more of my informative deep dive, kind of just people talk, discussion, theory craft kind of videos on. So stay tuned to that. Make sure to like, comment, turn on the notification bell, all the things you would normally do for the other channel on here to stay in the loop. Let's get into it though. First and foremost, let's break down the characters that I'm basically talking about right now. Oops, this was from my subathon. First and foremost, we have Ainz. Ainz, his skill 3 basically reads that he has a silence plus insta-kill debuff after 12 turns. His skill 1 is an AoE stun, and although it does give an extra turn, it doesn't feel that impactful. And then finally, his skill 2 makes it so that not only does he take additional damage from light targets, he gives himself a counter buff and a barrier to the entire team, which is helpful and kind of de-incentivizes hitting you on occasion. But the important thing is that he takes a lot of damage. We're not going to address or really analyze how good or bad this is in this section. We're going to be doing that in the next. Moving along, though, the next character that we have to talk about is Albedo. And the thing about Albedo is that her skill 3 is a full strip and defense break, which is not really something that you can sleep on. It is a complete strip and also does decent damage, although not many people actually build effectiveness on Albedo. Her skill 2 is a decent nuke that also provides herself with a speed buff, assuming that one of your allies gets crit and you haven't been activated. More on this later. And for her skill 1, it is a semi-decent S1, or I guess basic skill damage dealing kind of attack that also scales proportional to the caster's max HP. It's kind of like a normal hit that also gives her combat readiness push, but the added bonus is that she kind of has a built-in 3F already with their skill 1. And now for the final character that we have to talk about, let's address the elephant in the room, which is Shalltear, who I think a lot of people will definitely say that she was pegged as basically the best looking collab character to begin with. But just addressing her kit, her skill 3 gives her 100% hit chance. It is a nuke. It also dispels all buffs from the enemy when you skill 3. And if you have higher attack than the enemy, you actually ignore resistance and you are guaranteed to strip all buffs before you actually land the attack, which is how a lot of people are one-shotting Ainz that are paired with characters like Ooal or Navy Captain Landy. When it comes to her skill 2, she does give herself attack buff at the start of turn, and at the end of her turn, she gives herself stealth, which is a very, very important distinction. This isn't like a turn 1 winter or something like that, where she gets the stealth at the beginning of her turn. It's only after she's taken a turn, so she does want to kind of obviously take the turn first. Her S1 is just a kind of simple damage dealing skill. It does do injury, but it isn't anything crazy. It does injure, but honestly, the thing that kind of throws this skill off a little bit is that actually the scaling on the S1 is a little bit poor. But again, not going to talk about how good or bad these characters are in this exact section. Let's move on into the next, which is going to be talking about the builds that people are using on the characters. Now, I do have a couple screenshots or a couple sites opened up here that I do want to kind of bring up, I guess, to not just, it's a little scuffed. Sorry, let me transform this real quick. Here is a site called the Fribbles E7 Hero Library. This is a site, as you can see at the top over there, you can see the address. If you want to see what other people that use the Fribbles Optimizer, which is a extremely, extremely helpful, I guess, gear library assisted tool, that is a third-party program that allows you to see what different people are building on their characters. And for Albedo specifically, I did want to kind of go and look at what kind of builds people are using. Now, as you can see by the statistics, the average is that most people are using something like speed plus health, counter plus health, no set and just speed, or something like this, and they're pairing the different combinations of builds with things like 3F or Aureus. Now, obviously, there's a bunch of other possibilities here, but these look a little bit capped because it's stuff like Days of Destiny, a complete random one, and something like Halag's Lance, which is a little bit cope. However, a lot of the builds right now show that they are building her very, very high HP with either a lot of investment in defense just because you want her to be an Aureus and they maybe include something like effect resistance, or they're running all damage and they're basically trying to one-shot any kind of variation of cleave team composition. Point of this specific section is just to show you what the community is kind of cooking up in terms of builds and damage And the next character I wanted to show off was Ainz, who, as you can see right now, is in a similar kind of situation where sometimes people just want to run whatever they have on them. But I do want to make the kind of disclaimer specifically about Ainz that although Albedo definitely has a better understanding or has a better read of what people are actually trying to use to make Albedo work or be successful right now, Ainz has the asterisk of kind of being used right now as a farm bot for the side story activity. A lot of people, or most of the people likely that are using the speed variation of him, are just giving him this so that he can do the side story event. And if you look at some of the builds that people are using on him, it's kind of indicative of that. This one build for Ainz has, I don't know, 4,000 attack, 350 crit damage, and his base speed with 100 F, which doesn't really make sense, although it is one of the highest equipment scored variations of him, and this is honestly probably just used to deal with the side story. Now, I do want to point out that before we get into Shalltear, because she is here, that Shalltear and the conversation of whether Shalltear is deserving of a buff is a little bit tough because she doesn't actually have enough data, and outside of basically assessing if a character needs buff or a change based off of Guild War and Arena and PvE, she was basically always going to be a character that could only be tested during the preseason, and the preseason, as you know right now, is not really being, there's no stakes to it. No one is really under any duress to try and make these characters work. There's a lot of memeing and going around, and there's people testing stuff like Light Sid, but if you were curious about the different builds for Shalltear, this is a pretty good one. This is 473 equipment score. I think this is literally an average of like 80 or something, right? Because it's like 81 or 82, because 80 equipment score times 6, that's 480. Yeah, so this is like 82, 83 equipment score. Absolutely ridiculous. But this is a crazy build. But as you can tell, a lot of people are running in that 250 plus range while being full damage. There are some builds, of course, that give her a little bit of bulk, and that's fine as well. But for the average person, I'm sure that you are going to just be using her as whatever you have, and so long as you have it on pen so that you can one-shot anyone that has evasion, basically. That was the section on the builds, just to kind of give you a basis or a foundation for what people are using, what these characters do. Now let's actually talk about the analysis of the characters and whether or not they need buffs, or they do need buffs, they don't need buffs. Now, here we go. So first and foremost, as you can tell, we have Albedo. There is a site, also known as epicseven GG, that kind of gives you match history data, not only to see what you or other people have played, but also the win rates and performance of certain characters. That kind of also acts like a mini Fribbles hero library in a sense, though it doesn't show you their stats. Now, as you can tell in, or by these stats, Albedo in Masters has a 51.54% win rate. In Champion, she has a 51% win rate. In Emperor, she has a 54.34% win rate. And actually, in Legend, she has a 59.14% win rate. Now, of course, the win rates, depending on where you are, will vary, and statistics are not everything. But the point of this, and the point of me bringing up the win rates to begin with, is that I do think that, regardless of how people see it, Albedo is a character that does secure a decent amount of wins. Now, to be clear, and because it didn't feel like it was quite evident enough from my last Albedo video, I was someone that has kind of advocated for Albedo needing a buff. Now, before I had seen all the different variances of Albedo's kits and their builds and how people were drafting her, I thought that she was pretty underwhelming, weak even at times, because a lot of people were trying to basically use this sort of Albedo build, something where she's got, 200 speed, and she doesn't do quite enough damage. Literally something like what you're seeing on screen right now, where this build, unfortunately, right now that you're seeing up here, despite it being very high equipment score or having a lot of stats, doesn't really do anything. There's no counter, so there's no threat of me getting countered with my S1 and getting one shot. There is no Aureus, so it's not even like she's a better Crimson Armin, because, if they don't draft an Aureus, I'm just going to run over the team. And honestly, with this damage, you're not going to do any damage to a cleaver. Like, a Ludwig is not going to fall over and die just because a 23,000 HP Albedo with 250 crit damage hit you. That being said, it is pretty indicative, in my opinion, that based on her win rate, based on her performance, that what we originally had seen about Albedo was wrong. She does have a lot of usage. She does have a pretty good win rate. And I apologize because in my last video, I did show that she was being picked quite often, but she was not really winning in those matches. However, what you didn't see was that although at the time I was ranked 50 in Legend, I ended in Emperor because I fought too many Albedos and I was losing. I can't really show that. I could show how much I'm fighting her right now, and I'm sure a lot of you guys have seen that. But if the fact that I, as a cleaver, was not able to win because of Albedo was not an indicator enough, just take a look at the win rates, like I mentioned before, right? She is being played by a lot of Legend players right now, or like high-ranking Emperor players, and of course, in these certain ranks, she has a good specific win rate, and that begs the specific question for Albedo: does she deserve a buff? And I think, despite everything that I've said, I can see why people would want to buff for her, but let me explain. Now, to be clear, I do think that in her current form, if you have good enough gear and you know what you're doing in terms of playstyle, you know, or you have a deep understanding of RTA, it's pretty easy to see how good Albedo is, and there are a lot of ways to utilize Albedo to counter things like cleave, to even counter certain standard compositions with Albedo as well. However, something that I do want to mention, and that is kind of the overarching theme of the collaboration, is that the collaboration in most cases is supposed to bring in new players. It should make veteran players happy, and to be clear, I think it would be a little bit difficult to have a collaboration that only appeals to new players and all the old players are all unhappy. However, I think that one of the failures, or maybe not failures, but one of the struggles of this collab is that Albedo is not someone that feels very, very free or like, you know, new player friendly for two reasons. The first reason is that building her, though maybe not the most complicated, is not as easy compared to other characters like Shalltear. But also, just for reference, this is not a very interesting or very impactful, like, wow, spectacular kind of character, because the build that a lot of people will find success on is one that doesn't involve destruction. The most consistent build for Albedo, as you can see here, at least in Masters, is a speed plus health build. It's a counter plus HP build, and the win rates reflect that. If you want to actually see the performance of builds that involve things like, I don't know, destruction, you can't even see them here because they aren't even being shown. That's how infrequent, or that's how unpopular running specifically destruction is. And in my opinion, the destruction Xander build, if you haven't seen his video, by the way, I suggest you go look at it. There is a one and only specific Xander build where he has enough attack, HP, and crit damage that when the Bacorn goes off, your entire team disappears. They explode. But as you could see by the popularity of the different equipment sets, this isn't actually possible, and therefore she is, by all accounts, a very boring character where the only kind of excitement you get out of her is when someone decides to hit you and you counter and you one-shot them. Which, again, is kind of cool, I guess, but not as cool as something like Navy Captain Landy's S3 or Abyssal Yufian's S3 when we first saw their kits. Now, that was Albedo, and to be clear, again, I do think that if you want a usability buff to the character, I think it would be fine. Because ultimately, unless if Smilegate decides to change how unless Smilegate chooses to change how Albedo functions in terms of kit, this will kind of always stay the same. She will always be somewhat of a boring character because they didn't decide to give her the flashiness of a Navy Captain Landy, the one-shot impact of like a Last Rider Crow S3. They decided to make her everything, but in doing so, without breaking the game, she's pretty boring. Now, again, does that mean that if you buff her in terms of usability, that she might kind of break the top end of RTA as well? Yes, that is very well what that could mean. But there have also been arguments that if you want to break the top end of RTA, and if you want to make an entire meta revolve around collaboration characters, that's what they've done in the past. They did that with Rem when she came out. They did that with Amelia when she came out. Ed was really good when he came out after the buff, and pretty much any character, Dizzy, Biken, whatever character you want to think of, any collaboration character, or shortly thereafter a collaboration character has come out, the collaboration character has been so good that the meta has revolved around them. So even if Albedo or any of these characters become so strong that they become overwhelming, the honest truth is that it almost doesn't feel unusual or atypical, which is an argument that I've seen, but not necessarily one that I subscribe to. It's just a perspective that I wanted to give. However, at the end of it all, my point, and I apologize because I'm trying to be very thorough with my explanation of this so that no one misunderstands anything, I do think that she should get a buff. It would be ideal if they could find a way that Albedo is more usable for the lower end players, because that is the player base that we're trying to capture with the Overlord collaboration. The rest of us are a sunk cost fallacy, of course, because we're playing the game anyways. But I don't know if they're going to be able to do that, because it feels like in most cases, you give her more HP, you give her better stats, you give her more damage, then she just becomes more overloaded at the top end. But like I said, I am in favor of a buff so that new players can become more addicted or become more attached to the game. Case in point, I guess point of all this is that I would be in favor of a buff, but I understand why it can be dangerous. Now, to move along, I do want to talk about Ainz, who is, I guess, also has the, or I guess also had the potential to be played in RTA, but the issue with him is that his win rate across any rank is extremely, extremely poor. And I mean, it kind of makes sense based off of what I mentioned before, but let's also just kind of address this Ainz character for a moment. Now, Albedo, I would argue, if you're trying to run the one-shot build, very, very difficult to build. If you're trying to run Albedo on something like protection set, also kind of difficult to build, because who has a protection set? Who is farming Golem, right? If you're a new player, it's not really on the table for you. You're just going to use speed plus HP. However, for Ainz is actually a character where if you have any of your Ancient Inheritance gear, if you have any of the free gear that they've given out, a lot of the gear that has effectiveness and effect resistance on it can be used for Ainz, right? And so therefore, although I do think that maybe the win rate of someone like Albedo is a little bit lower because, you know, they aren't able to, or you could maybe attribute the win rate of a character like Albedo, especially in lower ranks, being lower because they don't have the proper build on her quite yet. Ainz really shouldn't be that way. Running something like speed plus hit is not very difficult because if you're farming Wyvern for the first time, those are like the two sets that you get the most of, right? It's hit alongside speed, and then equivalency is going to be crit. But it shouldn't be that difficult to build him, and even more so if you really wanted to make Ainz work, you could, of course, use speed plus HP sets that we're given a lot of for free. But I do want to preface that again, a lot of people are likely using Ainz for their side story, and this performance, of course, is based on the Oath season, and I don't think a lot of people during the last couple of weeks of RTA were going to ungear their farming solution or their farming bonus just to play him in RTA because he wasn't that crazy. So therefore, I think that's where a lot of his win rate kind of suffers. But we do still have to talk about Ainz because even in Legend, where some players could argue that playing Ainz in Legend, throwing away a Legend or like the Legend potential just because you wanted to farm for a little bit, not worth it. So you could maybe argue in this case that they would take the game a bit more seriously, and if they needed to ungear their farming teams, they did that so that they could, I guess, guarantee a Legend frame or climb for a Legend frame. But even in that case, whereas Albedo has literally a 59% win rate in Legend, Ainz has a 42% win rate. Now, to be clear, this is just to kind of poke at the fact that Ainz is a character where he does kind of synergize sometimes against certain compositions that are slow. It doesn't kind of take away from the fact that he has a big glaring weakness, which is the fact that he is super, super, super weak to light characters. Now, if you take a look at any of the other popular characters in the meta right now, I'm sure that if you went to the hero analysis and you went to something literally as you see right here, even in Legend, the most popular characters involve characters like Savior Aiden, Navy Captain Landy, Unbound Knight Arrowell, just to name a few. Last Rider Crow even. All of these are light characters, and if you are someone that wants to, of course, try to play Ainz, you are immediately now starting with a minus 30% or an increased 30% damage dealt to your team. And of course, while Ainz does have strengths against characters like Laya, or against characters that are very, very slow, like maybe Abyssal Euphine, just that alone is enough, I think, to ward away players from playing him that much. And that is especially the case even in Emperor, where I would have expected to see the most play of him, because that's arguably the most competitive, where players have the most games because they're trying to hit Legend or they're trying to hit Emperor. And this, I think, is where the problem with Ainz lands. It's that not only is the eye test for him kind of bad, where a lot of people don't even really want to try him too much because it already sounds like 30% damage. How could I make this work? He's not some, waifu. I do like Ainz, to be clear. I think he's a Giga Chad in the story. However, because he already has so many glaring weaknesses, it already feels like there's a hurdle to try and make him work. And this, paired along with the fact that, again, he can get 15% on his S3, the fact that he has the additional weakness of like the S2 passive, the fact that people wanted to use him to farm, and just the fact that, honestly, it feels like he is not the most sexy character either, for lack of better words, also kind of makes him a character that I don't think needs a super, super insane kit overhaul, because if they did something like remove the S2 damage, I think he would be a lot stronger. But I do think that instead, playing him needs to be a bit more rewarding. However, I don't think personally that doing something like making it so that his S3 is irresistible, like or ignore ER, is going to be the only thing that they can do or should do in order to make him viable. Because the honest truth is that if you do make his S3 guaranteed, you still have an Aiden that is going to one-shot him, and just like that, it disappears. So if you were to ask me what I would probably give as a buff, and I have a bit more of a concrete answer for Ainz, as opposed for Albedo, who I think is kind of a touchy, very kind of 50-50 kind of character. I think that Ainz is a character who definitely deserves something like a number or an assortment of buffs that he gives himself, similar to the lore accuracy of what happens in Overlord, where he gives himself a bunch of buffs, and right before his fight with Shalltear, although he does have some lore accuracy where he does end up taking more damage to things like fire and light or holy fire, whatever the case is, if you were going to make the same sort of lore accuracy there to make him weak to light, why not also give him the multitude of buffs that can maybe help him from getting one shot by literally any light character in the game? In my opinion, I would prefer that and a survivability kind of change, or a buff where he can maybe go invisible or like gets hidden, something like that, as opposed to just the, okay guys, well, we'll just make it so that all we have to do is make it so that his S3 is irresistible, and that fixes the game. Because in all honesty, in my humble opinion, I don't think that does. I think that makes him be able to get his S3 off, but I think everyone is just going to target him immediately and then he's dead. Moving along, I would like to talk about Shalltear, of course, but as I'm sure you could probably predict, Shalltear was not available in the... Oh wait, she was. Yeah, oh no, sorry, just kidding. She does exist on the searchable function, but she wasn't playable in Oath Season. And if I want to kind of talk about Shalltear really quick, here are a couple things that I've noticed after seeing people talk about Shalltear, testing Shalltear, and just using Shalltear in general. Number one, a lot of people are definitely using her to farm because you couldn't use her in RTA, so why would you use her for anything else? But number two, I think she is a character who does exactly what she set out to do. Her showcase was the perfect example in one of, in my opinion, the rare times where Smilegate absolutely nailed a showcase. They picked her against a Navy Captain Landy and an Arrowwell team composition, and although she did end up having the escort stripped via having the Conqueror Lilius use skill 3, she overkilled the Aiden by a wide margin. But you'll notice, and you probably noticed, that I mentioned the team composition, and they did show the team composition that she fought against, and that was Aiden, a knight, and something that gave a buff to Aiden that would have made it more difficult to kill her with. So what that means is that in a specific case, or at least in one successful case that Smilegate wants you to see or visualize, Shalltear should be able to fight a knight, fight Aiden, or kill Aiden in one hit, and kill Aiden even if she has buffs on her. The issue is that now a lot of people are trying to use Shalltear in situations that are not isolated to this. And the reason why this is so impactful, or is so important to remember is because a lot of the complaints that I've heard people talk about when it comes to Shalltear is that Shalltear is dying to Karina Splash, or she's getting AoE'd, she's not as good as LPK after the buff, all these different things. And while I understand that's the case, you have to remember that although her S1 does absolutely no damage, like it really is like almost bafflingly like bad actually, her S3 was designed to be the main core of her kit. And the S1, rather, as we saw through the showcase from Smilegate, was specifically designed so that you could kill enemies like Arrowell, could kill enemies that were kind of tankier, like maybe like Navy Captain Landy, that had a little bit of health. But of course, the S1 also has to do damage. And the reason why they brought Candy and why Candy is such a good showcase for Shalltear is because even if Shalltear got shot, unless if the Candy salvoed, she was still kind of safe because she was stealth. Now, again, to be clear, I think a lot of players right now all agree, or I would say most players agree, that Shalltear has no problem one-shotting any evasion character. The issue is what comes after, because when Shalltear has to fight against things like Zio, or when Shalltear isn't guaranteed her turn, or if you aren't able to guarantee Shalltear's turn, you don't have things like the tankiness of a, you know, or like the, I guess the immortality of a character like Briar. If you're trying to counter evasion characters, you don't have the guiding light of Briar. You don't have the ability to cleanse and make another or set up another character on your team that a character like Zahak has. And even with a character like Last Piece Karen, if there is going to be an Aureus or an Adamant or things like that, you can't get rid of those. So although Shalltear does overkill and the Adam and the Aureus may not matter when you're hitting someone that is only evasion focused, because let's be real, Violet, Aiden, all these characters are not going to have, or Adamant Shield or have Proof of Valor or anything on like that. She overkills them. It does kind of make her a one-trick pony of killing the evasion character, and only if they have a knight and low damage characters after does Shalltear feel like the perfect pick. Like she is the absolute supreme perfect scenario to pick her in. Now, again, I do want to mention that I do think that Shalltear could receive a little bit of love if they do want to push her over into that phase where she ends up being good against every single character. But I want you guys to heed this warning. If they do make a character like Shalltear, who has an element, by the way, she's not an ML. If they make a character like Shalltear have basically no bad matchups outside of being outsped, this makes her kind of a candidate to be a Cannaaaa Hwayoung-esque kind of character. Now, again, that is a bold claim because, again, Cannaaaa and Hwayoung are quite strong, but Shalltear, with a strong S1, the ability to give herself attack buff, you can't one-shot her. She goes into stealth, which gives her more survivability. Her S3 has 100% hit chance. It is impossible to dodge outside of some weird finicky stuff. And her S1, or like her artifact, gives her healing. This is a recipe for disaster if you make her super, super element blind and has no downturns, essentially, which is what I think some people are suggesting for her in giving her a much stronger S1. But the honest truth is that although she as well is not the most interesting kit ever, just because all she does is basically one-shot Aiden, she is well balanced because, again, you can't just pick this character into AoEs. You can't just pick this character and get outsped. She has very clear weaknesses, but in her niche and in her specific scenarios, she's very strong. I like her a lot, specifically for when I have to fight and I'm fighting against like Aiden and Moon Bunny, or if there's a Politis or Celine and you know, Aiden. I think it makes her a very, very well-balanced, but very, very well-designed character, kind of similar to the way that Last Piece Karen originally was when she came out. Last Piece Karen, biggest weakness was that when you use her S2, if there's a Celine on the field, if there's a Moon Bunny on the field, it's game over. But now with Shalltear, you do actually have a similar kind of scenario where you guaranteed get the hit off, but now you can pick Shalltear and you can pick it into characters like Fat Cat plus Aiden. You can pick it into characters even if you do end up running a non-hit chance artifact. And if you are someone that doesn't have Last Piece Karen, you weren't lucky enough to get her on the Moonlight banner, well, guess what? If you have Shalltear, she does the exact same thing for 99.99% of cases. Anyways, though, if I were to buff her, I think that they could give her maybe some easier, like maybe a few more stats, like make it so that her S3 and her S1 don't crit, or don't need crit in order to do damage, which would be really cool if they gave her the Gala treatment or the Ravi treatment. But I think outside of doing something like that, I think if they're trying to make her into a super, super versatile neutral DPS, it's going to look a little weird for the meta. I'll be honest. Like, you're starting to, it will start to sound like you're starting to make a character that's on old Spectre Tenebria tier, Hua-Young Janua tier, which is kind of scary. But at the end of it all, like I said with Albedo, like I said with Ainz, like I said with everyone else, if you want to break the game because you want collaboration characters to be the forefront, the most meta-changing, meta-landscape involving character of all time, by all means, feel free to do so. These are just my thoughts, though, and I wanted to just, again, show off some stats, some information, some statistics to show off the win rate of the characters, why Albedo, I think, is a lot better than most people gave credit for her for, and just through the site to give you statistics, why Ainz, though some people say that he is also good, is not really quite as popular or even as successful as someone like Albedo, and there's data to back up both of these. Albedo has the data to suggest that she's stronger. Ainz, though some people anecdotally speak that he is strong against lower compositions, really does not have that. But then again, we're in a cleave meta where a lot of people are playing fast, so who knows? In any case, though, guys, that's going to be it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed this new content on a new channel. It is specifically for the new channel, and I hope you guys appreciated the breakdown. Again, this is more of an analysis, and I'll include timestamps so you can jump around and you can see whatever you like. But if you made it to the end of this video, thank you so much. The subathon just ended, and I'm already grinding and stuff, so hope you guys enjoyed the new content. I'm going to be posting here more, though, to try and develop a second channel to see what I'm going to do with it. Maybe it'll be more gacha related. Maybe it's going to be more people talk related. Who knows? But for now, it's called More Cannaaaa. Thank you again for watching, everyone, though. Thank you for all the support in these, literally this year. You guys have been amazing. I appreciate it so much. Thanks for watching. Make sure to check out the rest of my socials, Discord, YouTube, TikTok, Twitch, my main channel as well. I'll see you on the next one. Stay safe, stay healthy. Good night.